My job is to read. I work at a university teaching English and creative writing. And I edit a literary journal too. But I often find reading difficult. I get distracted, check my phone, look off into the distance, fall asleep. Inevitably, perhaps, I end up on YouTube, riding the wave of an algorithm, deciding whatever it is I end up seeing. I often feel numb, adrift. Of course, there's a comfort to this kind of feeling. It means I don't have to think at all, so that I can farm out those pesky feeling things entirely. But it also comes with a bruise. Because when you are adrift or numb, it can be very difficult to sense the edges of yourself. And certainly, it's difficult to get stuff done. This is when imposter syndrome sets in. And I think about the people I know at work, what they would think about the way that I spend my time. Bosses, colleagues, peers, friends, students, writers. Become convinced that they would know that I'm not up to the job, that I don't have the tools to perform it, that I somehow ended up in it by grand cosmic accident. It's a strange anxiety, but I don't think it's an uncommon one. And what I've taken to calling my screen reflex might happen for you via Netflix or Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat. And what this screen reflex has in common is the way that it takes us from the things that we want to do. And perhaps the way that it makes us feel. Because it's both an agency killer and a dopamine trap. And perhaps a way to counter some of it too. That is, if it is important to you to be engaged and clear and in control of the way that you interact with the world, and perhaps with yourself. That way, believe it or not, is essay. Yes, I said essay, and I really wish sometimes that the essay was called something completely different, because the kind of essay I want to speak to you about today is not the one you might have put together in a high school classroom. What I want to offer instead is closer perhaps to a philosophy for thinking, for being, even for trusting yourself. The word essay comes from the French for attempt or trial, from the Latin for weighing or sifting. In this sense, it's much more verb than noun. It's an activity designed to let you figure out what you think. Because the thing being weighed or sifted in an essay, the thing that you're trying to get to, is an understanding of the self in context. That is, an active reading of where you are in this present moment. Importantly, by coordinates that you set for yourself, rather than those suggested by something else, or even auto-played by something else. I think I'd describe essay as a measure of thought. And when you write one, you get the opportunity to settle yourself firmly, to address, I think, a little that drifting unease. And when you read an essay, you get the opportunity to connect with another engaged in that very same process. The French writer, Marcel Proust, called that connection soul on soul, suggested that it involved the impulsion of the mind of another into your own and received in the midst of solitude. Isn't that beautiful? A few years ago, when I was in the middle of researching a PhD about essay, I experienced the kind of shift in self which Proust describes. It was actually when I was midway through reading a long book by Proust. This is one of the volumes. It's called À la recherche de temps perdu, if your French is as terrible as mine is. In English, In Search of Lost Time. Proust is notoriously tricky, and I think I wanted to set myself a challenge to beat another reading slump. His sentences are long and stretched. Alain de Botton calculated that the absolutely longest Proustian sentence would, if you laid the words end to end, have stretched about 4 meters long. Around about this time, I was almost halfway through that slow reading, and I was tackling 10 pages or so of Proust a day, often with a pencil in hand, and most regularly while walking the dog. So please imagine me, if you will, pencil in hand, small blue book balanced precariously, spoodle in front, and tramping through the suburbs about 20 minutes to the north of here, about to have some kind of revelation. Because at this point, Proust was finally beginning to sink in. Through daily return, I'd learned to read his labyrinthine prose, and the words were sticking to me in ways that I'd become unused to. His rhythms, his particular syntax were sticking, changing, and I felt like I was beginning to think and feel in a voice very similar to that of the narrator, who's a man very similar to Proust himself. The plot of the book is unimportant, but one particular strand of it revolves around the narrator and his relationship with his grandmother. And on this day, which I remember vividly, I'd reached the moment at which the narrator's grandmother falls ill. It was at that point that I was brought to a standstill. And as I pulled out my pencil and began to underline the words on the page underneath a streetlight, which flickered itself on and then glowed more brightly as I began to read and reread those words again, all the while dog tangling himself about me, I felt something keen, something sharp, something bright. And then I realized it was grief. It was grief for my own grandmother, who died a year or so before. That is, through the strange journey I was taking through Proust's rhythms and winds, I'd been able to experience something acute, but also bittersweet. It was a feeling of being in the world, but also a feeling of being in that grief. As well as being about essay, much of my PhD was about my grandmother. I was interested, I guess, in the memories that she had, those that were her own, and those that she'd managed to keep in a ragtag archive of things, objects, stuff buried in the top room of her house. What I think I realized then, there on the pavement, under the streetlight, was that I was doing the research I was doing because of her death, that I'd sensed it coming somehow, even while she had been alive, anticipated it in the way that she'd grown older in snap cuts each time she came to visit from the United Kingdom, walking up the driveway to our family home, her hair less than it was, her eyes cloudier, her cheeks looser, but her body closer to its bones. For me, that realization was confronting, but revelatory. I get what you're wondering. Why is this sort of reading different to the kind of reading you might do? How is it better than the ways that you might spend your time? Even, what does it have to do with anxiety? I'm not here to talk about better. What I want to offer instead is a glimpse, I guess, of the rush of pure feeling, of agency, which another's drip-fed soul had provided me access to at that particular moment. That it was through Proust's trying, weighing, sifting that I'd been able to think within, think through the grief I had for my grandmother, rather than just about it. What's more, it changed the way I wrote too. Because after that pavement moment, I tried in my writing to continue the conversation with myself, which Proust's work had allowed. I wrote about the death of my grandmother directly, of how she'd changed and suffered. And those objects which she had left behind, instead of feeling final, became evidence of a relationship that continued, evidence of our intertwining. I think, too, that my own essaying helped to fit some permanent plot to this intertwining, this interconnectedness between myself and her. This plot, this constellation, is what I've taken to calling an algorithm of my own making. And this algorithm is why I believe in essay, as practice, as philosophy, as a verb, as a way to think through the things that we sometimes find tricky to articulate, those things that make us sad or anxious or worried or often make us feel adrift. Because I know that when I can think like this, that I can keep the imposter from the door, that I can settle myself more firmly within the world, and that I can feel myself more connected to it too. Thank you.